Thank you very much for the invitation to come along today. Look, I've had that great privilege of being an elected representative for almost 20 years, and when you're elected by your local community to represent them, it is really a deep privilege, because they do impart in you the confidence to represent them. They might not necessarily agree with all of the things you say or do over your time as a representative, but it is a real privilege, and something that I know most MPs really value. And I know MPs sometimes have a bit of a checkered reputation, but you know, I'm not sure I could think of any MPs who are in Parliament other than to try and do the right thing. You know, as I say, what the right thing is sometimes can be disputed. But I also then had the great privilege to be the Minister for Education here in New South Wales, and also the privilege to actually hold that portfolio for some time. The frustration sometimes in public life, public affairs, is that ministers chop and change very quickly. And having been the Minister for Education for 6 years is a long period of time. In the 150 years that New South Wales has had a parliament, 6 years made me the 5th longest serving education minister for this state. And interestingly, I represented a constituency in far western New South Wales, so I live in Griffith. So I've represented everywhere from sort of just west of Wagga down to Mulwala, all the way from Mulwala down the Murray to South Australia, up to almost Broken Hill, and then across, so including places like Pooncarie, Hillston, Hay, Condobolin and West Wyalong, almost across to Park. So I've represented that kind of southwestern corner there for, as I say, for almost 19 years. You know, the great thing about representing such a broad and diverse community there is that you get to see, I guess, the best of the community, and in some cases, you know, the most difficult of communities. And I really took with me into my time as an MP, but particularly my time as a minister, those experiences that I saw in my electorate. And you know, I was a National Party MP, and I was going to say before, 3 out of the 5 longest serving education ministers in New South Wales were National Party or Country Party MPs. People always think of education as being kind of a Liberal or Labor thing. 3 of them were National Party, Country Party, and 2 of them were Labor. So, you know, regional ministers for education have been more of the norm than the exception. And even the current minister, Sarah Mitchell, is she's an upper house MP from Gunnedah. So that's been a really positive one of the really positive things that, you know, maybe not so many people have been aware of. But that kind of then brings me to what I do now with the University of New South Wales. So the University of New South Wales has set up an education institute, and they've named it after the Chancellor of the University, David Gonski, and he obviously also wrote the school funding report from about 8 years ago, 2011, 2012. And then he wrote a subsequent report for the Turnbull government around equity and how you, what are the best ways to actually spend additional money in education. So he has a very esteemed reputation in education, and of course a significant person within the life of the University of New South Wales. So the university set this institute up and have appointed myself as the director, and they've given us this sort of massive remit of equity, access and excellence, which is basically everything in education. One is how do you make it fairer, and I'll talk about that in a moment. How do you make education fairer? How do you provide more access to education, not just school education and early childhood, but how do you actually provide access to higher education, particularly for students who have barriers in front of them. So it kind of this massive remit, and then we kind of took that away and looked at, okay, where we can't do everything. You know, in life, if you try and do everything, you end up doing nothing. So we kind of looked at where can we have the greatest impact? What are the areas of research and advocacy where we can have the greatest impact? And we've narrowed it down to this issue of equity, because we know from not just the data in Australia, but the data internationally, that the more equitable your education system is, the more high performing it is. So we've got fantastically high performing schools, high performing students in New South Wales and Australia, certainly are absolutely world class. The problem is it's not distributed as widely as it is in other countries. So we have, these great pockets of fantastic students that tend to sort of coalesce into certain schools, and then we have pockets of disadvantage where we have, lots of disadvantaged students all in, aggregated into schools that service an overrepresented group of disadvantaged students. So our challenge is how do you actually make that fairer? How do you actually, instead of having this sort of thing that goes like that, how do we balance that up a little bit? Because this is where we do underperform internationally. I want to just show you, I know it might be a bit hard to see, but there is just one chart, and you can just, you can see from this chart, this is basically OECD countries. And this is from the most equitable, so where they actually have, I guess, closer to an average distribution of students across their schools. So in any one school, you'll have some really advantaged kids, middle kids, and disadvantaged kids. So on this side of the scale is where you have the most equal distribution of students, and this side is where you have the least equal distribution of students. So on this side, you have lots of concentrations of disadvantage in schools. You can't read the countries, but you can see Australia there is the 5th worst in the OECD. So we are beaten to be the worst by Brazil, Chile, Hungary and Mexico. And on this side, you've got Finland, Sweden, Norway, New Zealand, Canada. So this is kind of the challenge for us. So the role that we play, well, the role that we've started to play with the Gonski Institute is, what do we do to shift that way, the line that way, instead of that way? And one of the recent examples just last week was the announcement by the state government about creating an additional selective school. So selective schools have been part of the mix in New South Wales for many years. And nobody's talking about dismantling the existing selective schools. But the policy question then is, do you expand them? So the Premier, who is a great friend of mine, but also one of the great benefits I have of being a former minister, is I can say what I like and it doesn't matter, no one's going to ring me up and, well, they might be cross with me, but they can ring me up and I can ignore the phone call, whereas I previously couldn't ignore the phone call. But when you look at that announcement, so it was the commentary was that in southwestern Sydney, in the growth corridor there, particularly around Camden, lots of new residential areas, and there are no selective schools. I think Hurlstone Ag's probably the closest, and then there's a couple of others. But most of the selective schools are in the eastern suburbs, the North Shore, and northwest. Certainly, there are none outside of Sydney, Newcastle and Wollongong that are exclusively selective. So the thing was, okay, there's not enough out there, let's create another school. Now, whilst I can understand that there would be parents, and this is where politics and policy stuff each other up, mix each other up, there would be pressure from parents to say, look, our kids are out of Camden and they've got into a selective school and have to travel all the way into Sydney Boys High or whatever it might be. Can we have another one out there? The problem is what selective schools do is they aggregate high-performing students into some schools and take the high-performing students out of other schools. As I said, once you've got this, you can't get rid of it, right? So no one is advocating you get rid of the existing selective schools. But actually creating more actually shifts us to the right instead of shifting us to the left. What we do want in schools is a comprehensive school where you might have a gifted stream, so we certainly want to pick up students with either academically gifted or musically gifted or gifted in sport, whatever it might be. Take them and extend them, absolutely. But we want to do them within a comprehensive school because they are often, and we would have all experienced this at school, they're often the ones who are the positive peer group, the ones who, you know, that the other kids look up to and go, wow, you know, I want to compete for that, you know, I want to compete against their performance. Unfortunately, when we take them out and we aggregate them into individual schools, it might be great for those kids, but in terms of the system, then you know it does provide that negative, because then what we do is we have comprehensive schools that don't have those high-performing students as role models and peers for other students. And we do know that from the Australian research that if you come to school with a particular disadvantage, you know, your parents' background or whatever it might be, that's one thing. But it's a disadvantage, it's an additional disadvantage to be in a school with other students who are also disadvantaged. And I mean, we can understand this from a practical perspective. You know, you're in a class of 18, 20 kids, let's say, you know, relatively small even. And if the teacher's got to deal with 10 kids who are running amok in that class, that's an additional disadvantage, as opposed to a class of 30 kids where everybody's sitting there and, you know, doing what they're told. The teaching and learning that can go on in that class is substantially different. So that's why, one of the reasons why concentrations of disadvantage is actually an additional disadvantage to whatever that particular student walks in the door with. So we want to get away from concentrating disadvantage in schools, and we want to actually spread it out. So as I said at the beginning, you do want a school that's got you know, extension classes for gifted and talented students, supports in place for students with disabilities or learning needs, and in the middle, where you've got kids in the middle, you want to be stretching them to achieve higher. That's the kind of ideal system that you want. Selective schools kind of, you know, go contrary to that. And then New South Wales has more selective schools than the rest of the country combined. So this argument also that selective schools will improve New South Wales' academic performance. Victoria has like 5, and Victoria, on lots of the measures, outperforms New South Wales. Or there's certainly no evidence to say New South Wales performs brilliantly compared to Victoria. We've got 48, they've got 5. So there's actually no evidence to say that actually improves the performance of New South Wales education generally. So, you know, selective schools is one example. You know, non-government schools, and I say this with kids who go to a Catholic primary school in Griffith, you know, non-government schools do essentially the same thing. They do segregate out students based on the ability to pay. That is a significant factor in terms of this segregation of students. And non-government schools also have the ability to actually reject the enrolment of a student, or indeed to expel or to suspend. Government schools can suspend as well, but can expel students. So it does give non-government schools a greater ability to choose the students that they have. It might be not a direct choice, as in you need $20,000 to be able to enrol your student at this school. That selects people out automatically. So, you know, that's one of the reasons why Australia is where it is, because we have one of the most segregated in terms of the different sectors. School funding, again, one of the things that David Gonski has contributed substantially to. We used to have a funding model that distributed money to schools not necessarily based on need. Like when this all first came up, this whole school funding thing, the Gonski reforms, I said, what, so we don't fund schools on need? And we didn't particularly. A lot of the ways that schools are funded, particularly the difference between the Catholic system, independent schools, and then the government system, were historical anomalies. Even the way some independent schools are funded compared to other independent schools are historical anomalies. Monte St Angelo in North Sydney, where my wife went to school, is an independent school that receives something like 200% more government funding than it is entitled to based on the students it has. The equivalent, I can't remember the name of the school, in the Canterbury area, a girls' private school, receives substantially less than the equivalent independent school. This is comparing independent to independent on the North Shore. And that's just arisen over sort of decades of kind of special deals. And when you hear about special deals, these are the special deals that they're talking about. Special deals for one school, and, you know, the bishop knew somebody from, 50 years ago, and, there were all these kind of special, all of these special deals. And that's why there is so much tension around this issue of funding. Now, the Catholic sector are upset about the way they're funded compared not just to public schools, but compared to independent schools, because there have been this history of special deals. But even within the government sector, there were not, I wouldn't call them necessarily special deals, but the way they made decisions about how they funded individual schools were not necessarily made accurately. I think they tried to be fair, but not necessarily accurate. So you would have a school in Fairfield that might get, right, this school's going to be, we're going to pick 50 schools to be on a special program, and each of those schools is going to get an extra $250,000 to help them support disadvantaged students. So 100 schools, they'll pick 100 schools. The 101st school gets zero additional. So the 100th school gets the extra money, the 101st school gets zero, and the 102nd school gets zero. So it wasn't a particularly equitable thing. You're either on or you're off. So you could have one school here getting extra money across the road with similar sorts of students with similar needs, gets no additional money. What the Gonski funding reforms did was they actually looked at every single student in every single school and then funded the student. And then the money, the funding, the government funding would move with the student. So whether you're a student that went to a government or a non-government school, there was an amount of money that student would receive. It's a bit more complicated than that because with fees, etc., etc. But where they've made it, I think, really fair is the degree to which that student needs additional help. If that student is from a low SES background, or if that student has an Aboriginal background or a non-English speaking background, for whatever area of disadvantage that individual student receives, or the school that student goes to gets a little bit of extra funding. So whether that kid goes to a public school or a private school or a Catholic school, that little bit of extra funding followed the student. So now what that meant is that if there's one school here and it's got 100 students from the bottom quartile of SES, they'll get extra money. And if there's a school across the road that's got the same number of students from the bottom quartile, they'll get the same amount of money. So it was a much fairer and more even way of distributing money to deal with this issue of need. So you'll see schools in Western New South Wales, for example, like schools like Wilcannia and Lake Cargelligo and places like that, are getting huge increases in funding. Part of the challenge for them is actually how to spend the money, which brings me to what I think is the most challenging problem of equity in education, which is how do you distribute staff across schools equitably? I don't have the data, but I would be pretty confident that the most experienced and qualified teachers in New South Wales are pretty strongly distributed in the northwest of Sydney, the north-eastern suburbs, inner west, probably Newcastle, Wollongong, not too bad. But their concentration would be mostly around where students are most well prepared for school. So we've got the highest quality teachers, I shouldn't say quality teachers, the most experienced teachers in front of students who in a sense need them the least. And then you've got places out, let's say in southwest Sydney or Western Sydney or Western New South Wales or the North Coast, where you've got some of the most disadvantaged students in front of teachers who are most inexperienced. How do you get, so the question is, how do you get that distribution, how do you fix that issue of distribution? And it is a really challenging question, because you can't say to people, you must move over here to teach, you must go and teach in Mount Druitt, or you must go and teach in Aids when they want to teach in Leichhardt. It is a really challenging policy problem, but one of the things that we're really focused on. The question just even of subject specialisation. You know, you can have, you know, you've got Eddie Wu teaching you at Cherrybrook Technology High, one of the best and most engaging mathematics teachers in the country. You might be at a high school in Western New South Wales and you haven't had a maths teacher for 3 years. I mean, the difference between what the children in Eddie's class are going to learn in mathematics as opposed to those kids is profound, and something for all of us to be concerned about. The last couple of things. The issue about principal and teacher wellbeing. I've just spent yesterday at the Principals Conference in Manly, and you know, the rise in the number of acts of physical violence, threats of physical violence, abuse, bullying by students to principals and teachers has almost doubled in 6 or 7 years. And it's almost doubled from parents who are doing the same thing to teachers and to principals. And you know, if you think about, you know, I think about my kids who go to a school, and you think, you know, my kids' teachers have to deal with that. Not from us, hopefully, but you know, they have to deal with this. And how does that impact on the teaching and learning for my child and the other kids in their class if principals being physically threatened or having to deal with abusive emails and, you know, all of the well-being things? You know, you've got to be in the right frame of mind to do anything, let alone then stand in front of 20 or 30 kids and teach them. And if you're dealing with those kinds of things, it has an impact on the ability of teachers to actually lead that teaching and learning. So that is a growing and significant problem, but not exclusive. We all know this is not exclusive to schools, right? Every day you hear about paramedics turning up to something and people throwing rocks at them or whatever it might be, or you know, when you go to an accident emergency now, you know, there's security because people are just, you know, being a bit crazy. And then you only need to listen to talkback radio and you wonder, why is bullying increasing in the community? You turn on talkback radio, it doesn't take you long to work out that these are profound issues within our culture. And, you know, they're not going to be resolved at schools. You know, these are significant cultural issues for us. Now, is it social media? Is it, I don't know. Is it the pressure we put on ourselves? I mean, Australia's never been richer, but never been angrier. You know, everybody seems so angry and everyone's in such a hurry, right? But we've never been, in theory at least, or on average, wealthier. But I don't know that we're necessarily happier, and certainly not translating into the way that we deal with each other or that we deal with, you know, public agencies. And then the other thing, and this is I think the most important thing, is actually the well-being of children. And again, the data will show you that, you know, the rates of feelings of depression and I was listening to John Brogden on the radio last night talking about the number of attempted suicides. Not exclusive to young people, it's quite an issue for now people over the age of 55, men particularly, as John was saying last night. But you know, within schools, the sense of anxiety and sometimes hopelessness. You know, again, you would think in a country that's had 27 years of uninterrupted economic growth, and this is a growing problem. What if the economy turns down, and you're at school thinking, you know, maybe I won't get a job when I leave? I can only imagine that kind of is going to make it worse. So you know, these are two profound issues that are within schools but are beyond school and are cultural things. This issue about how we treat the professionals in education, and actually what's happening with children around their own well-being and mental health. And I do think they're very profound issues. And as an education institute, they're very much top of mind for us in how we deal with some of those issues. And I'll end with this very last this last thing. So Professor Pasi Sahlberg from He's an academic. He's taught all over the world. He's from Finland originally, and he's moved to Australia. And he's come to work with us, and he's a terrific guy. If you ever get a chance to listen to him speak or watch him anywhere, go and see him. But he's a real believer in this equity issue, that you have to fix this up. In any country, you have to balance this up as much as you can. You're probably never going to get it equal, but as much as you can. And one of his things is about how we actually provide nutrition to children. You know, he's got kids now that have just started school in Kensington, and he said, you know, they send them lunchbox with the sandwich and the apple and the carrot and the juice box. And he said every day he comes back home with the apple and the carrot left over. And I've got two kids, one in year 5 and year 3, exactly the same thing. And I say to my son, what are you eating at school? Because you're not eating any of this stuff. But he's a big believer in the nutrition issue. You know, parents are busy, and you know it's easy to make a Vegemite sandwich in the morning, and you know, but is that really enough to sustain a child who's trying to learn, and, you know, usually pretty active at school, to actually get them through? And I was talking to the principal from Galagenbone Central School, and they've actually started providing meals to their children. So I think breakfast is mandatory, so it doesn't matter who you are, breakfast is a mandatory like half hour at the beginning of the day. And then they provide a cooked meal for students who want a cooked meal. And he said the behaviour improvement in their school, serves quite a disadvantaged cohort of students, but the behaviour change in the school, the attendance, the performance of their children, the suspensions have dropped substantially, because, you know, kids who are not getting proper nutrition at home, not let alone not what's turning up in their lunchbox, but even what the nutrition they're getting at home, they're now getting at school. And you know, he said there's still lots of work to do. He said, but you know, it's proved to be like a substantial game changer in that school. So, you know, there's lots of difficult and challenging things in Australian education that we can try around this issue of equity. You know, providing meals at school is not something that we do in Australia. You know, it's you know, commonplace in other countries, but we just something we don't do here. And it's, you know, but there are some leaps of faith that we kind of need to take to try and deal with this issue of equity, and these are some of the challenges that we're interested in pursuing. And as I say, as a former minister now, I can say what I like. It doesn't matter who rings me up. I don't have to take their call, and you know, it's quite liberating. Particularly when you think about some of these challenges. But anyway, again, thank you very much. Thanks, Doreen.
Well, thank you.